How one gunner's improvised aim destroyed a Panzer column in minutes, September 20th, 1944. Dawn over Lorraine crawls in through a cold, white fog. The world is silent, except for the groan of tank engines somewhere beyond the mist. A Sherman sits hull down behind a hedgerow, its crew barely breathing. Inside, condensation drips from the gunner's cracked sight glass. He wipes it again, but it stays clouded, useless. He glances at the auxiliary periscope, a simple slab of glass meant only for orientation, not precision. It will have to do. He memorizes the field in fragments. A fence post, a ditch bend, the outline of a farmhouse roof. Through the fog, faint silhouettes crawl forward. German Panzers, engines coughing, tracks squealing in the damp earth. The gunner steadies his breath. He lines up the post, estimates the range, corrects the elevation by memory alone. The first shell tears through the silence. The ground jumps. Through the mist, a black flash. Impact. The lead Panzer jerks to a stop, smoke blooming from its hull. One improvised aim. One perfect hit. By late summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe was moving faster than logistics could follow. The Allies had broken through Normandy's hedgerows, raced across France, and now pressed toward Germany's western frontier. But momentum came with a cost. Fuel convoys lagged behind, supply lines stretched thin, and armored divisions that had crushed the Wehrmacht in open country now found themselves short of everything except confidence. Among them was General Patton's U.S. Third Army, sweeping east through Lorraine. The 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's spearhead, had advanced so quickly that many of its tanks were parked for lack of gasoline. Mechanics scavenged wrecked vehicles for spare track links. Gunners reloaded with mixed lots of shells, armor-piercing from one depot, high explosive from another. Yet rail remained fierce. The men believed the war's end might be weeks away. Across the front, the Germans were not yet finished. Though broken and retreating, they still had one weapon left, speed of their own. Hitler's high command ordered a counterattack to halt Patton's drive and regain ground lost in Lorraine. They formed Panzer Brigades 111 and 113, elite units equipped with Panthers and Panzer IVs, crewed by a mix of veterans and hastily trained replacements. Their orders were simple: strike fast, slice through American armor, and recapture the high ground near Arracourt, a cluster of French villages surrounded by low ridges and beet fields. The battlefield itself was deceptive. Rolling farmland, scattered woods, and shallow valleys gave no clear advantage to either side. But the September weather did. Lorraine's mornings were soaked in fog so dense that even the nearest hedgerow dissolved into gray. German tank commanders, proud of their superior optics, suddenly found them useless. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. What had been designed as a tank hunter's paradise became a field of ghosts. American crews had learned to fight blind before. In Normandy, they'd shot through hedgerows guided only by the echo of engines. Now, they used that same instinct. The men of the 4th Armored and the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion set up their Shermans and M18 Hellcats in hull-down positions, peering over ridgelines or hedges, waiting for silhouettes to move in the mist. Each crew rehearsed by memory. Range tables, deflection corrections, and quick elevation shifts for unknown distances. The problem was, the fog didn't just hide the enemy, it blinded the sights. The M70 and M71 telescopic gun sights inside American tanks were finely tuned instruments, but their lenses fogged under condensation. In the chill air, Moisture crept between the glass plates. Gunners wiped constantly, cursing under their breath as the image clouded again. When it got bad enough, they abandoned the scope and shifted to the auxiliary periscope, a backup designed for rough direction, not shooting. Yet some learned to make it work. They discovered that by bore-sighting the gun, aligning the barrel manually with a fixed landmark, they could walk rounds onto a target even without a clear view. A fence post, a barn edge, or the angle of a distant ditch could serve as a crude aiming mark. In training manuals, such improvisation wasn't even mentioned, but on the battlefield, it was survival. As dawn approached on the 20th, German Panzers of the 113th Brigade began creeping toward the ridges west of Arracourt. They believed American resistance was scattered. In truth, the fog concealed a line of Shermans already waiting, engines idling at low throttle to mask the sound. Commanders huddled in the drizzle, listening through headphones to terse radio calls. Contact, movement north, stand by. Inside one of those tanks sat a young gunner, one of many, who'd memorized his field the night before. He had scratched chalk marks on the elevation wheel, tiny reminders of where to set his gun if the range fell between hedgerows or barns. No optical clarity, no electronic rangefinder, no luxury of me, just instinct and cold calculation. Somewhere ahead, German tank treads clattered over a culvert. The sound carried through the fog like metal drums. American platoon leaders gave quick bearings over the net. Left of the barn, 200 past the fence. Not in degrees or mils, but in words everyone could picture. When the first shadow moved through the mist, the gunner steadied his breath. He remembered the chalk, the post, the rhythm of the traverse. He would fire not at what he saw, but at where his mind placed the enemy. The stage was set. The next few minutes would turn that fog-shrouded ridge into one of the most astonishing duels of the entire Lorraine campaign. The fog over Lorraine was more than weather. It was a weapon, one that neither side fully controlled. For the Germans, it promised surprise. For the Americans, it offered concealment. Every crewman in the 4th Armored knew that when the mist thickened, the battle would close to knife range. That morning, tanks of Panzer Brigade 113 advanced from the east in tight columns, guided by a few surviving road signs, and local farmers pressed into service. Their Panthers were powerful machines, thick armor, 75mm high-velocity guns, optics sharper than any Allied scope. Yet, in that whitened world, their strength became weakness. Their commanders could see barely 20 yards ahead. Radios crackled with confusion. Lead tanks slowed, bunching up the rest. In the open fields, those seconds of hesitation were deadly. American gunners waited behind invisible ridgelines. Many had already prepared their positions during the night, scraping firing pits with shovels and placing spare ammunition boxes within reach. The terrain around Lazy and Juvelais undulated gently, dotted with haystacks and barns that appeared and vanished in the haze. To a trained eye, these shapes became markers, not random features, but coordinates burned into memory. Every tank crew practiced walking their rounds, firing a high-explosive shell first, watching for the dust or flash of impact, then adjusting the next shot by instinct. It was a method born not of manuals, but necessity. In the absence of clear rangefinders, the earth itself became the guide. Some crews even drew crude maps inside their turrets, fence lines, orchard rows, telephone poles, anything that might serve as a landmark once visibility dropped to nothing. When the fog finally began to thin in places, faint outlines appeared, Panther turrets gliding like gray shadows. An order passed quietly through the American line. "Hold fire. Let them come closer." Platoon leaders used simple references: past the ditch, by the oak, at the slope. No need for compass headings. Every man knew the ground in front of him like his own heartbeat. Inside one Sherman, the gunner rubbed his gloved hand over the elevation wheel. He had chalked a white mark earlier, lining it up with the known distance to the road bend. He'd bore-sighted at dusk using a barn roof as reference. Now, that same roof was a faint blur ahead. His commander whispered, "Wait for it. Just past the post." To the Germans, the terrain seemed empty. The Panthers moved in confidence, their commanders half expecting retreating Americans. But within minutes, their illusion of control unraveled. When the lead tank reached the fence post that marked the Sherman's improvised 0 point, the gunner fired. The armor-piercing shell left a faint orange spark in the mist and struck home with a heavy crack. The Panther's front plate shattered at the lower seam. Not a lucky hit, but a calculated one. The second tank halted in confusion, unsure whether it faced mines, artillery, or an ambush. The fog reflected sound in strange ways, making it impossible to locate where the shot had come from. The American gunner's next round landed short, exploding against the road embankment and showering mud across the stalled column. He adjusted one notch up, instinct guiding the correction. The third shell slammed into the second Panther's turret ring. Smoke vented through the hatches. Across the hedgerow, other Shermans opened fire, their gunners using similar field-borne techniques. Some had aligned their barrels by eye at dawn, checking the direction of sunrise as a crude compass. Others fired short bursts, gauging range by echo time between impact and sound. These were not precision instruments. They were men fighting a battle of senses, memory, and nerve. German tankers, trained for long-range duels, found themselves blind and boxed in. Their turret crews spun wildly, searching for muzzle flashes. One Panther fired back blindly, its shell whistling over an unseen ridge. Another tried to reverse, only to wedge itself in the ditch beside the burning lead tank. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, 5 German tanks burned along a narrow farm road, their hulks barely visible through the fog. American units shifted position immediately, knowing counterfire would follow. The gunner inside the Sherman checked his ammo racks, 2 AP left, 3 HE, and exhaled for the first time in minutes. His periscope was still fogged. His aim had been anything but standard. Improvisation had turned the tide that morning. What began as a disadvantage, poor optics, limited sight, had become a form of mastery through adaptation. The Americans didn't outgun the Germans. They outlearned them in real time. The battle would continue for days, but the pattern was set. Vision against instinct, perfection against practicality. And somewhere within that chaos, one gunner's improvised method, a chalk line, a fence post, a breath held steady, would destroy an entire column before noon. War rarely rewards perfection. It rewards those who can adapt first. In the fog-shrouded countryside of Lorraine, every crewman inside a Sherman learned that lesson by heart. Their world was reduced to a few square yards of steel, the smell of burnt cordite, and the sound of breathing between shots. The first angle to understand is the human one. Inside a Sherman tank, the gunner's station was cramped and suffocating. Sweat collected on the eyepiece. The metal was cold enough to sting through gloves. He had no clear view, only a ghostly blur through his backup periscope. Yet this man's training took over. Each muscle movement followed a rhythm memo raised from drills at Fort Knox or the Mojave. Traverse right. Elevation, half turn. Steady breath. There was no panic, no time for fear. The only thought that mattered was distance, how far to the target, and how fast it was closing. Improvised aim wasn't about luck. It was a ritual of precision built from fragments of instinct. The tactical angle was equally crucial. American platoon leaders had learned to use terrain not as cover, but as a weapon. In Lorraine, elevation differences were measured in feet, not meters. Yet those feet meant life or death. Hull-down positioning became doctrine. Expose only the gun and turret, never the hull. A tank that could fire unseen was one that could survive. The gunner's commander, crouched in the turret cupola, peered through a sliver of periscope and whispered range corrections that were more intuition than science. They'd marked the map by landmarks, not coordinates. The barn with a collapsed roof became 1. The stone wall by the orchard became 2. Each number represented a mental rangefinder that replaced optics lost to condensation. The enemy angle tells a different story. The Germans fought with some of the finest tanks in the world. The Panther, with its long 75mm KWK-42 gun, capable of piercing a Sherman from over a mile away. But all that engineering meant little when the battlefield reduced visibility to 20 yards. In fog, the Panther's strengths, long-range accuracy, high-velocity armor-piercing shells, sharp Zeiss optics, were neutralized. What remained was weight and inertia. Panthers had to turn wide. Their turrets traversed slowly. Once a column halted, each tank became an obstacle for the one behind it. German commanders tried to deploy smoke shells or spread out, but the terrain offered no easy escape routes. The psychological angle emerged in those moments of uncertainty. American gunners often described the first minutes of battle as existing outside time, a tunnel where instinct replaced reason. The fog was both enemy and shield. When the first German shell passed overhead, the sound cracked open the illusion of calm. Yet discipline held. Crews didn't yell or scramble. They listened to their radios, adjusted hand wheels, and waited for the next shadow to cross the gun's arc. Every hit, every plume of smoke reinforced their confidence that improvisation worked. That knowledge, that they could fight without clarity, became a weapon of its own. Then came the balance of risk. A gunner who fired too early gave away his position. One who waited too long might be hit before he could aim again. Improvised aiming meant trusting a mental image, not a sight picture. A few crews tried a technique called walking fire, using the dust kicked up by each shot to bracket the target. Others fired high explosive first, adjusting by sound when the explosion echoed. It was crude, but brutally effective. The fog acted like an amplifier. Explosions sounded closer than they were, confusing the German crews further. In one section of the front, a tank destroyer platoon from the 704th Battalion coordinated with a Sherman troop by pure intuition. They couldn't see each other, only the faint orange arcs of tracer shells streaking through the mist. Yet they adjusted their firing rhythm to avoid overlap, alternating salvos every 15 seconds. The battlefield began to resemble an orchestra of unseen machines, each firing in turn, guided by rhythm more than sight. The time angle mattered most of all. Battles in Lorraine weren't decided by who fired first, but by who adjusted first. Every second between rounds was an opportunity for recalculation, for breath, for survival. The Sherman's manual traverse allowed the gunner to feel his corrections through the wheels. The Panther's powered traverse was smoother, but slower to respond when power lines or hydraulics jammed in mud. In that split difference, the hand versus the motor, entire duels were won or lost. By late morning, the Americans had discovered that their supposed inferiority, weaker guns, thinner armor, less sophisticated optics, could be inverted through improvisation. The gunner who had once envied the Panther's range now realized he didn't need it. The enemy's strength had no room to stretch. Inside his turret, the young gunner exhaled and adjusted elevation once more. He didn't see his target, but he knew where it was. In war, knowledge is often just memory sharpened by fear. Improvisation was not a matter of chance. It was the union of experience, technology, and leadership under impossible pressure. The technical angle reveals how the smallest details, optics, shell types, and gun mechanisms decided life or death in that fog. The Sherman's main sight, the M70D, gave a magnification of 5 power. But when fog condensed between its lenses, it turned into a gray blur. The auxiliary periscope, the M4, had almost no magnification at all. Yet its simplicity made it immune to moisture. Some crews tilted it slightly upward and used the frame edges as makeshift crosshairs. Others etched faint scratches across the glass to mark elevation. No manual taught this. It was battlefield evolution. The gun itself, the 75mm M3, had been considered outclassed by 1944. It could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor beyond 500 yards, but war had taught gunners that penetration was only half the story. A deflection off the turret ring, a glancing hit on the side plate, or a shot into the rear ventilation grill could cripple a tank, even if it didn't destroy it. When visibility was 20 yards, the front versus side debate disappeared. Every tank became vulnerable. Ammunition shortages shaped this improvisation too. The more powerful HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing rounds were scarce, usually reserved for tank destroyer units. Most Sherman crews relied on standard AP or APC shells. Some carried more high-explosive than armor-piercing rounds simply because depots sent what they had. So gunners adapted. Fire he first to mark the range, then switch to AP when they saw where the dust rose. It was an unorthodox dance between precision and chaos. Each round fired became both weapon and measuring tool. Meanwhile, the leadership angle unfolded on the radio nets. Officers commanding from half-blind observation posts issued orders not in coordinates but in descriptions. Fire when the column reaches the ditch. Hold until you hear the second engine. Those commands replaced abstract range charts with sensory anchors. The hiss of engines, the clank of treads, the echo off a barn wall. Platoon leaders coordinated their tanks like chess pieces they couldn't see, trusting the intuition of men whose world was reduced to a patch of fog 30 yards wide. In one documented report from the 37th Tank Battalion, a company commander named Captain Creighton Abrams later recalled how his platoons learned to fight by sound and instinct rather than optics. The fog, he wrote, was our equalizer. It stripped away the German advantage in sight and range. Instead of dueling from afar, the Americans let the enemy come to them. Their gunners did not need mathematical precision. They needed timing, patience, and nerve. This leads to the moral angle, the paradox of control in chaos. The German crews believed their training and equipment guaranteed superiority. They had spent years mastering the science of range estimation, target acquisition, and mechanical gunnery. Yet, against an enemy using improvised methods, that confidence became a liability. The Panther's commanders hesitated to fire without confirmation, unwilling to waste ammunition on uncertain targets. The Americans, by contrast, embraced uncertainty. To fire without full sight demanded faith, in their preparation, in their memory, and in the thin line between instinct and luck. There was also a deeper irony. American tanks, often ridiculed for their thin armor and weak guns, survived because they weren't built for perfection. Their mechanical simplicity allowed repairs in minutes. Their light weight let them reposition faster. Improvised aim was simply another expression of that philosophy. Adapt, overcome, keep moving. As the hours passed and the fog shifted, the environmental angle took over. The morning mist rose in patches, revealing blackened wrecks along the lanes. The smell of burning fuel and scorched paint filled the air. Mud churned under treads, every movement risked bogging down. Yet the Americans pushed forward, not in formation, but as individuals improvising their way through smoke and confusion. Each tank crew became its own decision-maker. Reports from that day later noted how the rhythm of battle changed. Instead of long-range duels measured in minutes, fights ended in seconds. The front line dissolved into dozens of micro-battles, single duels between machines only a few yards apart. A Sherman emerging from fog could fire point-blank into the flank of a Panther before either crew truly saw the other. In that world, aim was not a calculation, but a reaction. Improvised aiming transformed from an act of desperation into a doctrine of survival. Gunners began to trust the method, setting visual anchors in their memory before visibility vanished again. They knew exactly where a fence post or hill crest lay, even when they couldn't see it. Each time the fog closed, they still saw the battlefield in their minds. By noon, when the smoke thinned and sunlight finally broke through, the landscape of Lorraine was littered with shattered armor. German counterattacks faltered, unable to break through. American gunners stepped out of their turrets to stretch, their ears ringing, their nerves frayed. Some laughed quietly, unable to believe they were still alive. Others simply stared at the burning hulks, realizing how close the balance had been. Improvised aim had become more than a technique. It was proof that adaptability could outfight perfection. Leadership had trusted instinct. Machines had obeyed men, not manuals. And the young gunner, whose first shot crippled the lead Panther, was now reloading, waiting for the next shadow to emerge from the fog. The turning point of Arracourt was no grand strategy. It was moments like this, seconds of clarity born from improvisation. The fog did not lift. It thinned just enough to reveal the outline of catastrophe. Through the damp gray veil, the shapes of German tanks emerged like ghosts made of steel. The columns stretched along a narrow farm road bordered by hedgerows, their engines muffled to a low growl. Inside one of the waiting Shermans, the gunner steadied his hands on the traverse wheels, feeling their slight vibration from the idling engine. He had memorized every sound, every distance, every angle of that terrain. The fence post in front of him marked his zero. The ditch at his left was his margin. He waited for the right moment, when the fog became thin enough to expose a target, but thick enough to keep him unseen. A dull metallic thud echoed somewhere ahead, an engine backfiring. Then came the heavy clank of a transmission shifting into low gear. The gunner's commander whispered a single word: "Ready." He exhaled once, pressed his cheek to the sight, and adjusted elevation to the chalk mark he'd drawn hours earlier. The Panther's shadow slid into view, massive, deliberate, unstoppable. The gunner's thumb flipped the trigger safety off. The first shot came like a thunderclap. The 75% gun recoiled violently, filling the turret with a rush of burnt propellant. The blast shattered the silence. Dust and smoke burst through the hatches. The shell streaked into the gray and struck the lead Panther squarely at the lower glacis. A burst of flame erupted beneath the tank, followed by black smoke curling upward. The Panther stopped mid-road, its crew trapped inside. The gunner reloaded instantly. The loader slammed another round home, shouting "Up!" over the ringing in their ears. The gunner's left hand spun the traverse wheel half a turn, tracking movement to the right. Through the fog, another silhouette appeared, the second tank in the column reversing frantically. He aimed for the side plate, fired, and watched sparks leap from armor. The round ricocheted high, vanishing into the mist. He didn't wait. He dropped the gun 2 degrees and fired again. This time, the shell penetrated low, exploding inside the transmission housing. The second Panther lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. Now the road was blocked. The tanks behind began to bunch up, their commanders shouting conflicting orders over the radio. Some tried to swing off the road, but the hedgerows were too thick and the ditches too deep. They were trapped in their own formation. In the Sherman, the commander's voice came calm and steady. "Shift left, 3rd tank." The gunner turned the wheels again, each movement precise. He could barely see the shape of his next target, just the suggestion of a turret outline against the fog. He fired high explosive first. The shell hit the dirt bank short of the target, throwing mud across the road. The gunner watched the impact flash through his sight, recalculated by instinct, and loaded armor-piercing. The next round struck the Panther's turret ring. The explosion cracked open the hatch cover, sending debris skyward. Other American tanks joined in. Somewhere off to the right, an M18 Hellcat opened fire, its 76mm gun echoing sharp and fast. The battlefield turned into a blur of muzzle flashes, brief orange bursts swallowed by gray. German shells hissed overhead, their tracers cutting arcs that vanished into fog. One round struck the Sherman's right flank, but failed to penetrate, glancing off with a shriek of metal. Inside, the crew froze for a heartbeat, then carried on as if nothing had happened. The gunner's rhythm settled into something mechanical. Aim, fire, correct, reload. His world narrowed to the motion of his hands and the vibration of the recoil. Every shot pushed the German column deeper into chaos. Smoke now lay heavy over the field, the thick stench of burning oil and cordite filling every breath. Through it all, the gunner remained still, eyes fixed on the next silhouette that flickered into range. Minutes felt like hours. The enemy column began to disintegrate. Some Panthers tried to reverse, colliding with those behind them. Others turned sideways, exposing their thinner armor to the waiting Shermans. A few crewmen bailed out, running into the fog where rifle fire from hidden infantry found them. Then came the silence again, the kind that follows only after total destruction. The gunner's commander finally spoke. "Cease fire." The loader slumped back, arms trembling from exhaustion. The smell of gunpowder lingered like smoke in a church after candles burn out. When the haze cleared, the road looked like a scrap yard. 5 Panthers lay in twisted heaps, their turrets blown open, black trails rising into the morning air. A single Sherman, its paint blistered by heat, sat motionless behind a hedgerow. Inside, the crew stared at what they'd done, half disbelief, half relief. The gunner's periscope was still fogged. He'd made every shot by instinct, memory, and feel. His improvised aim had become something far more precise than any sight glass could offer. In the space of 10 minutes, one man's intuition had undone a German formation that had taken months to train and equip. But the day wasn't over. The sound of more engines began rumbling from the east, deeper and heavier than before. The radio crackled with new coordinates. The next wave was coming. The new sound came low and distant at first, like thunder rolling over hills. Then it grew into the unmistakable rhythm of treads and engines. A second German column pushing west. The fog thickened again, rolling across the valley like smoke from the wrecks still burning on the road. The Sherman crew could smell diesel and scorched rubber in the air. The gunner's pulse steadied. The last battle hadn't ended. It had only paused. Through the gray curtain, the first Panther of the second column appeared, turret swinging side to side in caution. Behind it, another followed, keeping tight formation. These crews had heard the reports of destruction ahead. They knew something waited in the mist, but not where. American tank destroyers had shifted position after the first fight, setting up new ambush points along the ridges. The Sherman platoon remained still, engines off now, metal cooling quietly in the damp air. The field was silent, except for the hiss of wind through grass. In his turret, the gunner made micro-adjustments by feel. He'd re-zeroed his elevation by looking down the barrel toward a burned-out barn on the horizon, barely visible through the haze. The chalk mark on his wheel still held. He flexed his fingers, rubbed soot off the hand grip, and leaned forward until his eye rested against the auxiliary periscope. The world beyond was nothing but shades of gray. He waited. The second German column advanced cautiously, spread thinner this time, each tank maintaining more distance. A reconnaissance vehicle, likely a half-track, moved ahead, headlights briefly piercing the fog. That light was all the gunner needed. He set his traverse a degree right, elevated slightly, and fired. The shell cut the air with a dull roar. A second later, the light vanished. The half-track exploded in a flash that momentarily illuminated the road, revealing the outlines of the entire formation. The American line came alive again. Tank destroyers opened from the flanks, their high-velocity guns punching through armor at ranges so short the impact sounded like thunder against a mountain wall. The gunner's Sherman joined in, firing fast and low. The recoil hammered his shoulder. The loader fed shell after shell without pause. Through the haze, the world flickered between orange and black. The German column broke formation, trying to fan out, but the terrain offered no mercy. Wet fields sucked at the treads. One Panther veered off-road and bogged down halfway through a ditch. Another tried to flank the ridge, only to expose its side to the Hellcat on overwatch. The 76mm round struck just below the turret, and the tank erupted into a plume of flame that turned the fog a sickly orange. Inside the Sherman, coordination became instinct. The commander no longer gave full orders, only words. Left. Short. High. The gunner responded to each with silent precision. He could feel the tempo of the fight, the rhythm between shots. One shell slammed into the glasses of a Panther, trying to advance. The next caught a Panzer IV reversing in panic. Smoke drifted through the periscope lens, smearing his vision even further. He switched to firing by feel, counting seconds between impacts, adjusting traverse by half-turns. Every sound became a signal. Every silence meant reload. In the chaos, a German tank fired back. Its shell struck a mound just short of the Sherman, showering dirt across the hull. The loader froze momentarily, blinking away grit. The gunner didn't flinch. He fired again, faster this time. The return flash from the Panther's muzzle gave away its position. The round hit square beneath the gun mantlet. The explosion blew the turret back, flames bursting from every seam. That was the moment the German counterattack began to collapse. One after another, tanks halted, their engines idling helplessly. Crews bailed out, vanishing into the fog. The radio chatter among the Americans was clipped, efficient. Confirmations of hits, ammunition checks, position updates. No one cheered. There was no triumph in killing machines hidden by mist, only exhaustion and disbelief that they'd survived again. The battle had lasted barely 20 minutes. When it ended, the valley was silent except for the crackle of burning fuel. The gunner lowered his head, his hands trembling from adrenaline. His commander leaned out of the hatch, scanning the gray horizon for movement. Nothing stirred except drifting smoke. The second wave of Panthers had met the same fate as the first, undone not by superior weapons, but by the invisible precision of men who learned to see without seeing. Later, as reports came in, officers tallied more than 20 German tanks destroyed that day around Arracourt, many by small groups of Shermans and Hellcats firing blind. Historians would later call it one of the most lopsided armor engagements of the war. But for the gunner and his crew, it was not strategy. It was survival, carved out of instinct, teamwork, and that fragile alliance between memory and chance. The fog began to lift by afternoon, revealing the battlefield at last. Burned tanks lined the lanes like broken statues. The earth was pitted with craters. A single fence post still stood at the edge of the road, the same one the gunner had used as his 0 point that morning. He stared at it quietly, realizing that one wooden post had defined the fate of an entire German column. Improvised aim had become the scalpel of victory, and in its smoke-stained silence, the battlefield of Arracourt stood as proof that adaptability, not perfection, would decide who endured the war's next dawn. By the time the fog finally burned away, Lorraine looked less like farmland and more like a graveyard of armor. The wrecks of Panthers, Panzer IVs, and half-tracks dotted the ridges and ditches. Some still smoldered. Others were silent hulks, their hatches open, tracks twisted off. The air carried the sour tang of burned oil and steel. American mechanics moved between the carcasses, checking for salvageable parts, tools, radios, undamaged machine guns. The quiet after the storm was surreal. For the gunner and his crew, the day blurred into a series of motions: clean the barrel, restock ammunition, report positions, await orders. They had destroyed more tanks in a single morning than some battalions managed in a week. But no one celebrated. The men were too drained, too aware of how narrow survival had been. They'd fought without visibility, with improvised methods, and had somehow lived to tell about it. At command posts, the scale of the victory began to emerge. Arracourt had been meant to be a German counterblow, a test of whether the new Panzer brigades could halt Patton's advance. Instead, it became their undoing. The 4th Armored Division, outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, held its ground. Reports listed more than 80 German tanks and assault guns destroyed in a series of engagements from September 19th to 29th. American losses were a fraction of that, around 25 tanks and tank destroyers. Yet the numbers told only part of the story. Intelligence officers noticed patterns in the after-action reports. Repeated mentions of short-range engagements, limited visibility, improvised gunnery, and unorthodox range-finding. What had started as individual acts of adaptation now appeared as an emerging field doctrine. Gunners who had once struggled with optics learned to exploit the limitations of both sides. In close terrain and poor weather, the Sherman's agility and crew coordination often beat the Panther's precision. Field commanders took note. They ordered reconnaissance patrols to map every rise, hedgerow, and ditch line that could be used as natural aiming landmarks. Crews were instructed to rehearse firing without telescopic sights, to rely on judgment, memory, and feedback from their loaders and commanders. What had once been improvisation became preparation. In the ruined villages nearby, French civilians crept out of cellars to see what the fighting had left behind. They found fields littered with the remains of two armies that had fought almost blind. Some villagers wept quietly at the sight of burned German crews lying beside their machines. Others handed out bread and wine to American soldiers who barely had the strength to eat. War's scale shrank in those hours, from nations and divisions to single exhausted men sitting beside the machines they had outlived. The young gunner whose shots had started the destruction of the first column sat on the turret edge, helmet off, his face streaked with soot. He stared at the road ahead, where the wrecks still smoldered, and tried to make sense of it. He didn't think of tactics or doctrine. He thought of the moment he'd chosen to fire, of the fence post that had become his sight, of how everything after that was a blur of recoil and smoke. His sergeant said nothing. He didn't have to. The silence between them carried more weight than any victory speech. At night, in the after-action report, the commander wrote a brief summary. Enemy armor destroyed in heavy fog. Engagement ranges under 300 yards. Gunnery executed by direct estimation. Excellent discipline under poor conditions. No mention of the fence post, the chalk marks, or the periscope scratches. The report was factual, detached, efficient. But history, as it often does, hid its truest story in the spaces between words. Arracourt proved that even when technology failed, training and adaptability could bridge the gap. Improvised aim was no accident. It was instinct weaponized. And in the days ahead, as more German attacks came and failed, that same lesson would echo across every gunner's turret in Lorraine. In the days following the battle, the fog gave way to rain. The fields of Lorraine turned into a sea of mud, swallowing shell casings and footprints alike. The men of the 4th Armored Division moved carefully among the wrecks, marking enemy tanks for recovery and photographing what remained. Engineers catalogued the burned hulks, each Panther's serial number, each shell hole, so intelligence officers could analyze where every hit had landed. It became clear that what had happened at Arracourt was not luck. It was a demonstration of pure adaptation under pressure. American gunners had proven that intuition, coordination, and speed could dismantle an enemy built on superior machinery. Many after-action reports included phrases like, "no line of sight," "shot by sound," or "adjusted by splash." Such terms baffled desk-bound officers reading them days later. Yet those phrases represented the evolution of warfare in real time, the transformation of improvisation into doctrine. Manuals were quietly updated. Instructors at gunnery schools began adding lessons on field expedient sighting, teaching recruits to use memory and natural terrain when optics failed. News of the victory spread quickly through the ranks. To the exhausted tankers, it felt unreal. They had fought without seeing the battlefield, and still won decisively. To the Germans, it was a shock. The Panzer brigades sent to reclaim Lorraine had been among the last equipped with the new Panther models. Many of their crews were replacements, but their machines were formidable. They were supposed to crush Patton's advance. Instead, they had been erased in less than a week by forces that fought mostly blind. Historians would later call Arracourt the last great tank victory for the Americans in Europe. But at the time, it felt more like endurance than triumph. Crews spent their nights repairing vehicles under rain, stripping parts from disabled tanks, and sleeping inside cold hulls. The fog returned each morning like a ghost, and every sound beyond the ridgeline set nerves on edge. The gunner, still haunted by the rhythm of battle, could hear echoes in every idle engine. When replacement crews arrived, the veterans shared quiet advice. "Forget perfect range," one said. "Learn the ground. Know where you are, even when you can't see it." They pointed to tree lines, barns, and telephone poles, landmarks that had saved them when sights failed. Improvised aim was no longer an emergency trick. It was now part of their muscle memory. Intelligence summaries from the following week showed the broader consequence. German armored strength in Lorraine was broken. Their counteroffensive failed completely. The Allies now held the Herd initiative all the way to the Moselle River. Yet the victory carried a strange melancholy. Each Sherman crew knew how thin the line between success and disaster had been. The fog had protected them once. It could have just as easily concealed death. In the mess tents at night, men spoke of the battle in fragments. One remembered the sound of metal folding under pressure. Another recalled the faint orange glow inside the fog when a tank burned. The gunner, when asked how he managed to hit so many targets without sight, shrugged and said only, "I guessed right." But everyone knew it had been more than guessing. It had been instinct guided by discipline, something that couldn't be measured on paper. Weeks later, when the weather finally cleared and the front moved east, the wreckage of that battlefield remained untouched. Farmers would later plow around the rusting shells and twisted armor, reminders of a day when sight had failed, but courage had not. Arracourt became a symbol within the 4th Armored Division, a place where ordinary men had faced extraordinary odds and won, not through technology or luck, but through adaptability. The fog of Lorraine had taken their vision but sharpened something deeper. And as the division rolled toward the German border, every gunner carried the same unspoken lesson. Sometimes victory belongs not to the best-equipped soldier, but to the one who can still aim when the world goes dark. The battle at Arracourt was never meant to be remembered as a clash of giants. There were no grand offensives, no sweeping maneuvers worthy of history books. It was, at its heart, a fight between men and fog, between instinct and machinery. And yet, in that confusion, the U.S. 4th Armored Division proved something timeless. That adaptability is the purest form of strength. For decades, historians would study the numbers: tanks destroyed, units engaged, coordinates on a map. But those figures missed the essence. What defined Arracourt was not the weapons or even the victory itself. It was the quiet discipline of gunners who learned to aim without sight, to fight without certainty. Their improvised aim was not born from desperation, but from trust. Trust in training, in comrades, and in the unspoken rhythm of survival. When the war moved east and the fog of Lorraine lifted for good, the lesson endured. Manuals would later be written on site maintenance, periscope drills, and range finding under low visibility. But no manual could capture what those men felt in that silence before firing. A heartbeat stretched across eternity. A choice made in blindness that decided history in seconds. Arracourt was proof that war is never won by perfection. The finest optics, the thickest armor, the most calculated plans, all crumble when uncertainty takes the field. What remains is the human will to adapt, to find a way when the instruments fail. That is what carried the gunner's hand steady on the traverse wheel, what turned a fence post into a gun sight, what transformed fear into precision. Long after the smoke faded, veterans of Lorraine remembered the silence that followed the battle, the sudden absence of sound after the chaos. In that stillness, they understood that what they had achieved was more than victory. It was revelation. Sometimes, clarity doesn't come from what we see. It comes from what we remember, what we feel, and what we dare to trust when the world around us disappears into fog.